Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore concepts that allow us to broaden our view of the world. You'll hear interesting topics, meet fascinating guests, and discover who you really are. Using the time-tested practices of astrology, you'll learn how to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Astrology, art, and spiritual adventure on Turning of the Wheel TV with Chris Flisher. Hello, my name is Chris Flisher, and this is Turning of the Wheel, a show about astrology. And I've got a great astrologer on today, and we're going to talk about perhaps to many of you, a little known concept about astrology, which is called the solar return. When we are born, our planets are cast in a moment in time, and those planets are what dictate our personality. But every year, the sun returns to the same position it was when you were born. So if you were born at 12 degrees Aries, when that time comes back around, that sun is going to land on that chart. And also, the sun is there, but the other planets are in different positions because they all move at different speeds. So that casts a sort of a different chart. And it's sort of a harbinger of what is to come in the year ahead for you. So it's very important. Now, the solar return, it doesn't always happen on your birthday. It may happen the day before or the day after, but it's in the neighborhood. And what astrologers do is we look at that chart. It's kind of like your birthday present. And we say, this is what you could look for in the year to come. And my guest today is Dietrich Pessin, and you're going to be talking about the solar return, which is a fascinating topic, and I know that you're very good at this. So,
well, I've studied solar returns, and solar returns are a very interesting study. You know, they're the moment where the sun returns to the exact point where it was when you were born. And you get this chart for it. So I was curious about, well, what exactly does that describe? Is that your day? Is that your year? Is that, you know, the week before? Is it the week after? What does that entail? So I decided to do a lifetime study. So I cast, and I did this with a friend, and we printed out every single birthday chart.
oh, interesting.
Throughout the entire life. And we did various systems because in astrology, it's technique, you know, this technique or that technique. And we used two different techniques, and one was to cast the solar return for the place where you were born.
Ah.
The other one was to cast it for where you live now. So
and did they differ?
Oh yeah, they're different. And
well, it depends upon how far away you live.
If you're going back through your life, you say, oh yeah, when we were 4 years old, we moved from Marlboro to Florida. And so then you change all that for that birthday, and every birthday change the address, made very different. So what happened was you lost patterns by using exact location. So the thing about astrology is to be able to recognize patterns and be able to make those connections, link one to another. So therefore, the study I then called Solar Links. And the Solar Links takes the solar return based on birthplace. So each and every solar return is based on the exact place where you were born.
Right. I think I prefer that. It seems to make, logically makes
more
sense.
Because,
you know, you sort of, if that was where you arrived, why wouldn't that be the permanent spot,
right,
point of reference?
And actually, for any chart that you do for yourself, your point of reference is your birthplace. It's the strongest spot on the planet for you. And so I noticed when we did these chain of events that there was a change in the pattern that occurred at the very top of the wheel, which is called the midheaven.
Right.
And that midheaven would occur in the same modality, cardinal, fixed, or mutable, for about 10 years. So you'd have mutable signs for 10 years on the top of your wheel.
Interesting.
And then it would change to fixed signs. It would back up, okay? It would back up into the fixed signs for about 10 years.
Huh.
Then it would back up into cardinal signs for about 10 years.
Interesting.
The 10 years it depends on how close you live to the equator. Because you get further away, then it could be 12 years.
I see.
And the more north or south you were born. So these patterns, when they change, they are then called change years. So I can do a lifetime of your solar returns and spot where the biggest changes in your life occurred.
Based on the position of the midheaven and whether it's
That's
an immutable
right.
sign. So the mutable signs, for those of you who don't know, are Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces. So if you're in that, that's what Dietrich was referring to. The fixed signs, obviously we know, is Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, and Aquarius. And then we have the 4 cardinal signs, Aries, Cancer, Libra, Capricorn. So if you're in one of those signs, you're going to be in one of those solar return signs for roughly 10 years.
Right.
Do you find in that time frames that, especially since it's tied to the midheaven, that's typically the career, the occupation, or what the person is occupied doing. And I would caution you to think that occupation does not necessarily mean what you get paid for. It's more how you occupy your time. If you're a stay-at-home mom, that's your job, and it's a tough one, believe me. I've done that. But also, if so in that time frame, you would see certain things begin to recur
Right.
based on that typical thing. So every 10 years, roughly, you would be shifting the modality.
Right, the modality, and therefore shifting the way you do things. And then there were times when there was this wobble,
Oh,
when it would go into the next set of modality
and then back.
and then back up a year. And I called those bounce years. Well, Elvis Presley, we all know who Elvis Presley was.
sure do.
He had bounce years when he was drafted into the Army.
Oh, yeah, took him off his course.
Took him right off his course. And he was very popular, making movies, making all kinds of great music, gets drafted, goes to Germany, meets the girl of his dreams. They're all of 13 years old, she was.
Right.
They would call that something else
Yeah, they would
now.
today, yes. He
Right.
wouldn't get away with that.
Yeah, and on top of it, his mother died during those bounce
She was a
years.
very influential person for him,
Right.
too. Very, very powerful.
So these were the years I called bounce years. And you could see how he bounced around. He's in the Army for 2 years. He finds this little doll that he brings home. His mom dies, which crushed him. And he went through all sorts of changes before he went into his next modality for the following 10 years. And when he came back, he was in a whole different mode of performance.
He was. He really is a real progressive kind of chameleon in that regard, because you can see that, I mean, we can divide his life. As a matter of fact, I think I have a box set that has 3 different periods of his life that he'd gone through, where he was the early rock and roller, then he became more of this Las Vegas kind of guy, and you know, he just had real iterations of his character completely changing.
So these are exactly the kinds of things where your tone changes, you're on a different track, you think about things differently and do things differently. So it's
like
always interesting when, say for instance, somebody had mutable signs that came in, and Virgo was on the midheaven. So now you're taking the actual sign. So we have mutable signs, we have Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces. So which one of those mutable signs does the next 10 years start?
Oh, so does it progress through that? Does it start with Gemini at the top of the chart?
Yep, and then it...
From Gemini to
well,
Virgo?
it may... No, it's not a given.
Oh, interesting.
It may start with Virgo, for instance. Okay, come in with Virgo. So that means you are really focused on the labor in your life, the work in your life, cooperating with others in your life, and that the next 10 years is going to be about mastering that phase or that topic in your life. If it's cardinal, and say it's Capricorn that starts your 10 years. So you want to start a business.
So let me ask you this: if that, I understand the concept, but I'm not sure everybody else does, but midheaven is a point, much like the ascendant, that will change with time over the course of time, and this is different from your natal midheaven.
Right.
So that's everybody has a natal midheaven as well, which is where you would see sort of the definition of your type of character or your type of perhaps your occupation or how you occupy your time. This is referring to where it is at the time of the solar return, which would be
Right.
your birthday, or the actual solar return, as I said, defines when the sun returns to the exact same degree as it was when you were born. So where the midheaven is at that point, for those 10 years, you could be very well involved with, say if you were a Gemini, you could be very well involved with writing. Or if you were a Gemini, you might be involved with being on television. I should look at my chart. You could, and all those sort of rules would apply to the sort of the focus of your occupation.
Right, right. And it was very interesting also to find when you're around 33 years old, you have the ascendant matches your birth ascendant, and the midheaven matches your birth midheaven.
Ah.
So it's that year when you're doing things your way, when you're finally saying, enough of you trying to tell me what to do and how I should, and I'm doing this because I want to do this.
Ah, interesting. Wow.
So it'll come up again. It'll happen again.
Wow.
Another thing about bounce years is what is interesting is that people get taken off their track for different things. Like
Right.
maybe they want to write a book or travel to Africa and study the people and whatever, and then their mom gets sick and they become their mom's caretaker, and they end up taking their mom's biography.
And they're totally thrown off track. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're no longer studying things outside themselves. They're studying things that are very close to home, studying things about the mom, being her caretaker.
And that's a boundary that would be in that sort of that what I would look, which was theoretically kind of like a retrograding action where it's
Yeah.
going back and forth, where you have that sort of bounce.
Exactly.
Those years tend to be more in flux. Yeah.
Right. Oh, yes. You can't nail things down the way you could in other years.
Right.
Here's another thing about solar returns, just in general. If your birthday's in October, then the day of your birthday, my birthday's October 7th, so July 7th is when the sun will square my birth sun.
Right.
That's when my solar return for next October can start to be read.
Oh, interesting.
I can read the solar return and apply it to the events that happen July 7th and thereafter.
Huh.
If there's a moon phase right near that July 7th, that's very telling about how dynamic this birthday year comes in.
And again, that would all be indicated by the house in which it occurs.
Exactly.
The area in which it occurs and whatever's going on in the neighborhood. So the solar return really is a fascinating glimpse. I always recommend people get them for their birthday because it's sort of like, here's a, you know, sort of like a sneak preview of what your year is to come. And more importantly, I would say it's a good time for you to send your focus, and you may find that your focus is there anyway. If you go back in your life, I think one of the greatest things about astrology is sort of that backwards glance where you begin to see where these events, and you can tie them directly to events in your life when you were bouncing or not, and you see those times.
Well, you know what else? Eclipses tie right into the solar returns. So I would find when I did this lifetime, this solar links, I think of it as a chain of the sun, like you're wearing a necklace and this is this birthday and that next one and next one. And so when I would see, for instance, in the solar return chart, let's imagine that there was a moon at 21 degrees of Scorpio in your solar return this year. So I'm going to say, wow, the people, particularly the women in your life, the children, the babies, or your projects that are babies, that are particular to the year when there was a solar eclipse at 21 Scorpio, which I think was 2013? Was it? Was
Right.
it?
I think so, that's right.
Yeah,
it rings a bell.
November of 2013. And that would have been a time, here it is, November of 2012 it was the 13th of November. That time period, that eclipse activating the moon of today's, let's call it today's solar return, brings those events to life here and now.
It's sort of a culmination.
Yeah, it's a stepping stone.
Stepping stone.
You're going to reach back into those years and make those connections and say, well, yes, that's when I met my wife.
Right.
Okay. That's when this, that, or the other happened. And so the other planets as well, I look to see around the wheel of the solar return what planets are sitting on eclipse degrees.
Very
Those are
interesting.
the ones that are talking to me.
And
Those
that
are,
would make a big difference depending upon the planet and the characteristics of the planet.
right.
If you've got Mercury on that point, you're probably going to be involved in some sort of communication of some sort, and this is where you begin to get real granular information out of the charts. Same is true for all the other planets. The interesting thing about the solar return is that the solar return and the moon, of course, we know move very quickly, but the other planets have their own speeds. And so they're going to be at different spots along in your chart at that moment in time when you do that sort of freeze frame. We know we have those freeze frames when we're born, but when you do the solar return, the planets are going to be in different positions, except for the sun. Obviously, that's why it's called the solar return. It comes back to where it was when you were born, and it's by degree. So the precision is fairly important, I think, with regard to...
Right, but when you look at the wheel of the solar return, the sun can be in any house. And then the following year, it goes backwards by 3 houses. It goes a quarter of the wheel. So the wheel will turn backwards. So if you have, let's say for instance, you have a solar return and the sun's in the 1st house this year. So next year it's going to be up on the 10th. The following year it's going to be in the 7th,
and the 4th.
then the 4th, then back in the 1st. So it is expressing the entire wheel. You know, it is presenting itself, bringing to you new experiences, developing, you know, in the way where the sun is shining light on various areas of your life. So the sun will occur, let's say the sun occurs in your 2nd house. So your focus is going to be on money matters and accumulating things. And perhaps if you're an artist, maybe this is the year when you want to sell your art, when you want to have a show. This may be a very good time for...
I'm a little confused. If you're coming back to, if the sun is coming back to the same degree, wouldn't it be in the same house?
Well, your wheel changes in the solar return. You're not your house system. If you're born with, what's your rising sign?
22 Virgo.
22 Virgo. But your solar return may have, for instance, might have Gemini rising this year.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
So that sun's going to land in a different house.
Oh, because you put the ascendant back on the, you put the degree of the ascendant back on that. I got you.
Right,
Okay.
right.
That makes sense.
You
Because
have
I mean,
a different wheel, but same sun.
exactly. But you're by degree.
Yeah.
The sun will return to the same degree of your birth degree.
Right.
So that's
Exactly.
that's the only distinction that you've got to make. I want to be sure people understand that. So if your sun is at 20 degrees Gemini and 20 degrees Gemini comes back again, the sun will be at that point. That's where you cast the chart for that time, finding the ascendant, which is going to be in a different area, put that on the horizon,
Right.
and then see where the sun lands.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you get the focus of what that house is about. The sun is in it. It's the brightest house in the wheel. It's the house that's shining all of its stuff for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is what's important about this, I think, to have this kind of information, is it literally, you know when to hold and when to fold. That's the old tried and true sort of aphorism for it, but it is appropriate because when you are best informed, you're going to make the best decisions. That's always what I've said, you know, we're best prepared when we're both best informed. And this does give you the energy to step into your greater most accessible potential that you possibly have, especially I think with regard to career. Many people of our generation are going to go through many iterations of career, and the generations to follow, we're not going to be in careers for a long time as perhaps our parents were. So this would be especially accurate for careers. I mean, it's a good indicator where you could be and what you can do, what the potential is, when to send out your resumes, how to put yourself out there. You know, all those things are incredibly important, and the timing is there. When to have a family. Now, you mentioned 33. That is when I had my first children. I had twins.
Oh.
And interesting, they were supposed to be Geminis, but they were Tauruses.
Uh-huh.
It would have been more appropriate if they were Geminis, but nonetheless, that's okay. They're Tauruses, and they're typical Tauruses too, which is sometimes good and sometimes bad. Nothing against Tauruses, but
Another interesting thing is that the sun and the moon will both come back every 19 years.
right, the Metonic cycle.
Right, on the Metonic cycle,
Right.
which is in this book as
Right.
well. When the sun and moon return to the same place when you were born, you get sort of an inner and outer satisfaction of your life, and you're able to have a complete sense of relationship.
Well, it's sort of the ego and the emotions together.
Yeah.
So you have that sort of symbiotic representation of who you are. Even if you're born with difficult aspects of the sun and the moon in your chart, if they're squared or whatever, you might be able to really crank up that characteristic. Yeah.
The sun and the moon love each other no matter what. You know, don't you think? I mean,
Oh,
really.
I do. I mean, that's
Yeah.
the mother and the father. They sort of, that's who they metaphorically represent. Yeah.
Right. Doesn't mean we all had loving mother and father either.
But they came together for the purpose of your birth, so
Right.
nothing else. That's why
But
you're here.
I'm talking about just their relationship with one another. So if they're in a, for instance, a square angle to one another, which may seem like a tough sun and moon to live with, come on, every single month it happens twice.
Right.
The sun and the moon will square to one another. They love making that point. You know, there's a statement. There's squares are motivating energizers. You know, they really get things going. And full moons, for instance, are people that, if you're born with a full moon or have a full moon in a solar return, that's a real strong indication that this is a change of a relationship. Princess Diana married Charles when she was having a new moon solar eclipse on her birthday. She divorced when there was a full moon on her birthday chart in her solar return.
Wow.
So, you know, those are landmark years. New moons, full moons. So there may be a new moon within 24 hours or so of your birthday. It counts. It counts as your birthday moon. And then a full moon can be showing all the cards on the table, the end of a matter, the end of a relationship, or some type of ending.
Some sort of transition of some sort where
Transition.
you're going from one phase to another. And especially we see it in people who are so public like that, because they really lay their cards on the table, so to speak, and it's really accurate when we study these famous people, because we see the events that happen with them.
And their lives are not their own.
Their lives are not their own.
They belong to us.
They certainly do. And,
Yeah.
and we become the voyeurs of their lives,
Right.
watching them as they go through. But they're fascinating to study because we can see these characters who take on these fascinating roles. And it's all throughout history. The charts of the famous people are just amazing to look at. They have such a depth, and you can easily see where they went and where they've gone. The solar return also brings about the capacity, as you mentioned, the moon, and the house in which the moon is in, which is going to be indicative of. Now, would you think that it would be an emotional indicator for the year, or would it be a...
Yeah, it definitely can be, but it could also be a routine indicator. This is where you're going to be spending most of your routine. This is where you will attach routine.
Huh,
Okay.
routine.
This is where you will be eating the most, you know. This is where your emotional tides are the strongest in this particular area. So if it's in the first house, it's about your personal self, maybe about your body, maybe about your health. If it's in the second house, it's, you know, going to be most likely about your pocketbook, about your talents, about how you suffer highs and lows.
And they can be both. They can be both ways. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
a person could go on a health kick with that,
Right.
and you know, or they could also have, you know, or I think perhaps more importantly, it's more of an emotional quality. Yeah. Interesting. And so then, when we look at other planets in that, I would think of something like perhaps Mars. Of course, being in Aries, I'm prone to Mars, but I would think of that. I always think of that as the great motivator, and where you might see more action. If that's in a particular space, it would really be an indicator of what's to happen in your year to come, or where to put your emphasis, where to, you know, put your motive.
Then also, it's the study of, is Mars in a strong sign for itself?
Right, exactly.
If Mars is in a sign like Gemini, it goes in any direction that it's pulled. Anybody can pull you off your track. But if Mars is in a very focused sign like Aries, you know, or even Capricorn,
Yeah.
you know, then you can expect to accomplish your goals, move forward quickly. So if we're looking at your lifetime and we're saying, gee, when should I, you know, really put all my eggs in that
Right.
basket? It might be when Mars is in those go-getter signs. If it's in the sign of Taurus, it's very materialistic. it's very, very much indicated in acquisition.
Acquisition, right.
But
Acquiring and
things
fulfilling
move
resources.
slowly. Okay, they're more methodical. Where Mars is usually, hot, ready to go, the foot on the pedal, And
I know all too well.
Yeah.
It's funny. It is interesting, but I do find that to be the case. And of course, if Mars goes into Cancer, it's gonna be
make a nest.
It's not quite the same, exactly.
Yeah.
It's fascinating because these sort of the solar return, what we're talking about, brings us to it's like a sneak preview of what is to come in your year and how to best manifest that, how to best play that hand in that cards. And I think it's important that we understand that we are cyclical beings living in a cyclical world. And that whole wheel of rotation, yes, things do recur. We always have a return to a place in time, mathematical return, but we have to remember that we're further down the road, so the scene has changed. It's much like literature. Some of the greatest books in the world are much the same story, just that they've become contemporized. I've heard that phrase that there's only 7 really great plots in the world because they're just under different characters and at different times, and those are sort of based on the mythological archetypes and stuff like that. So it's fascinating to see that, and the moon is an incredibly important part of our lives, and people will recognize this quite profoundly, especially with regard to how they move and the changes, and the eclipses are incredibly important in that regard. So when it comes to this sort of the solar return, and it's not to say that you're going to be bound by that necessarily.
No, and the moon can be seen as the ambassador, so to speak, between your environment, close to your world, and the outer world as it makes contact and aspect to the other planets. So it's going to change. It moves along. If you have an astrologer study your solar return, they can see when these planets are going to be set off by the motion of the moon, because the moon is going to move.
It's the great trigger. Yeah.
Right. So the moon is what will develop the wheel. So the sun and the moon always have a relationship. Even if there is no aspect, they always have a relationship.
In some capacity, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I personally keep what I call an astrological diary and sort of trying to map my aspects or what's happening in the world with my moods or my days. I'm not always religious about doing it every day, because not every day is, beautiful or bad, but I try to keep track of those things, and I have noticed distinct patterns beginning to evolve, and it's quite accurate. It's a fun little chore. If you're into astrology, you sort of look up where things are in that day and then sort of mirror them. I often do it in a backwards glance, because I think it doesn't sort of preset my emotions or preset my agenda for the day or whatever, much the way we were talking about earlier. So my guest today has been Dietrich Pessin. She has a wonderful book called Lunar Shadows 3, which you can get on Amazon or on her website, lunarshadows.com, which you can see on the screen up there. And it gives you a great deal of information. I don't think, you do need to know a little bit about astrology, but not a whole lot. You can still get through this without a problem, and I think you'll be curious as to what you find. So, Dietrich, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you.
It's been great to have you. It's always fun to be with you.
Thank you.